Have you ever imagined that on your wedding day, you'd discover the person you love is your own father? A horrifying secret, a shock that shatters your entire world in an instant. Today, we're diving into a true story filled with tears, love, and twists you could never predict. Marrying my own father. Brace yourselves because this journey will break your heart, but also fill it with powerful emotions. The story begins in 1991 when John Miller, a 28-year-old man from Texas, met Laura, a 20-year-old woman with deep brown eyes and a gentle smile, in a small village in Saudi Arabia. They fell in love amidst the brink of life and death. John, an American soldier, and Laura, a compassionate Arab girl who cared for the wounded with unwavering devotion. Their love was as beautiful as a dream, yet as fragile as a candle in the wind. John left with a promise to return, leaving Laura alone with a tiny life growing inside her, a child she named Nora, meaning light. Laura raised Nora single-handedly through the darkest days in the capital of Saudi Arabia, holding on to the hope that her daughter would have a brighter future. Nora didn't let her mother down. She overcame every hardship, earned a full scholarship to Stanford University in the U.S., and started a new life full of promise. There she met an older man who became her mentor, her confidant, and eventually, her lover. They fell deeply in love and decided to tie the knot. But on their wedding day, when Nora's mother, Laura, arrived, a devastating truth came to light. The man Nora loved, the man she was about to marry, was none other than John Miller, her own father. A secret buried for 20 years, a tragedy no one could have foreseen. How could a love story lead to such a heartbreaking end? Can they overcome this shock and find light in their lives again? This journey isn't just about a love that crossed borders. It's a tale of loss, pain, and forgiveness. John, after all these years, became a successful businessman in the U.S., but his heart remained empty without Laura. Meanwhile, Laura raised her child alone in poverty, hoping Nora would have a better life. But fate played a cruel trick, forcing them to face a truth too painful to accept. Join me as we step into the first part of this story, where it all began. A beautiful yet unfinished love between two people from entirely different worlds. Grab your tissues because you won't be able to hold back your emotions with what's coming next. John Miller, a 28-year-old man from Texas, set foot in Saudi Arabia as an American soldier. With short black hair and deep blue eyes, John had a strong presence, but his gaze carried the loneliness of a man far from home. During a stop at a small village in Saudi Arabia to resupply, he first laid eyes on Laura, a 20-year-old girl with long, glossy black hair, deep brown eyes, and a smile as gentle as moonlight. Laura was tending to a wounded soldier, her hands skillfully bandaging the injury with homemade herbal remedies. She wore a faded blue traditional robe, but her beauty captivated John instantly. He approached her, attempting to communicate through clumsy gestures. "Thank you," he said, pointing to the bandaged wound on his comrade's arm. Laura smiled, nodding, her eyes sparkling with warmth. Though they didn't share a language, they felt the sincerity in each other's gaze. In the days that followed, John seized every chance to return to the village. He brought chocolate bars from his rations, giving them to the village children, and always found ways to talk to Laura. Despite the language barrier, their hearts grew closer through shared glances and smiles. John told her about his hometown in Texas, where he grew up on a small farm with endless cotton fields. "The sky there is so blue," he said, drawing a circle in the air with his hand, trying to describe it. Laura smiled, her eyes shining, then pointed to the desert sky and whispered, "It's beautiful." Laura shared her dreams of a peaceful life, where she could open a small shop selling herbs and care for those in need. John listened, sensing the tenderness and strength in her soul. He often brought her small gifts, a chocolate bar, a pack of gum, and Laura reciprocated with simple tokens, a hand-embroidered handkerchief or a pouch of dried herbs to protect him from desert fevers. One afternoon, as the sun set in a fiery red glow over the desert, John pulled Laura behind a mud wall, away from the curious eyes of his comrades. He took a thin silver necklace from his pocket, its pendant engraved with John and Laura. "This is a gift for you," he said, placing it around her neck. Laura touched the necklace, her eyes welling with tears, and whispered, "Thank you, John." They stood there hand in hand, watching the sunset, as if the world belonged only to them. But that happiness didn't last long. One morning, John received orders to leave immediately. He had only a few minutes to rush to Laura. Under the scorching sun, he hugged her tightly, promising, "I'll come back for you, Laura. Wait for me." Laura nodded, tears streaming down her face, clutching the necklace in her hand. In early 1992, the Gulf War began to subside, but the scars it left behind still lingered. John Miller, the American soldier with short black hair and deep blue eyes, received orders to return home after nearly a year of fighting in Saudi Arabia. Before leaving, he rushed to a small village in Saudi Arabia where Laura was waiting. Under the harsh desert sun, John found her by a well, her deep brown eyes reflecting both joy and sorrow. Laura held tightly to the silver necklace engraved with John and Laura, a gift he had given her. John hugged Laura tightly, feeling her warmth amidst the searing heat of the desert. "I'll come back for you, Laura. Wait for me," he said, his voice trembling with emotion. Laura nodded, tears rolling down her cheeks, but she said nothing, only gripping his hand tightly as if to hold him back. John kissed her forehead, then had to leave as the sound of his unit's truck horn blared. He got into the vehicle, looking back at Laura one last time. She stood silently in the desert, holding the necklace, watching John's convoy disappear behind the dunes, her heart heavy with grief. Laura didn't know that, in that moment of parting, she was carrying a tiny life inside her, the fruit of their love. When John left, she felt an emptiness she couldn't describe. She stood there in the vast desert, the wind blowing through her faded blue robe, but her heart felt as if it had been torn apart. Laura didn't dare hope John would return, for the war had already taken so many of her loved ones. But she kept the necklace, a cherished keepsake of the love she believed would last forever. Days later, Laura began to notice changes in her body. She felt more tired, and nausea struck her every morning. An elderly woman in the village, who had once been a nurse, examined her and said, "You're pregnant." Laura was stunned, her hand resting on her belly as tears streamed down her face. She was both overjoyed and terrified. Overjoyed because this was a gift from John, but terrified because she didn't know how she would raise a child alone in wartime. She whispered to herself, "John, do you know? We have a child." The war had devastated Laura's village. Her family was gone, her home destroyed, and she was forced to leave to find a new life. Laura decided to head to the capital of Saudi Arabia to look for work and prepare for the child she was expecting. Before leaving the village, she stood amidst the ruins of her old home, gazing toward the desert where John had disappeared. "If you don't come back, I'll raise our child on my own," she told herself, her voice firm but filled with pain. Laura took the necklace with her, the only keepsake she had of John, as a reminder of the love that had once blossomed amidst the brink of life and death. She didn't know that, on the other side of the world, John was also carrying the pain of their separation. He returned to Texas, but his heart remained in the desert with Laura. Meanwhile, Laura, with a tiny life inside her, embarked on a new journey. A journey full of hardships, but also brimming with hope, to protect the child of their unfinished love. Laura found a job washing dishes at a small restaurant in the central market of the capital. Every day she worked from early morning until late at night, her hands soaked in cold soapy water, her back aching from standing for hours. Her meager wages were just enough to rent a dilapidated room in a slum near the market. The tiny room had peeling walls and a leaky roof that dripped whenever it rained. But it was where Laura tried to build a home for the child she was expecting. She often sat on the creaky bed, her hand resting on her belly, whispering to the baby, "You are my light, no matter how dark life gets." At the end of 1992, Laura gave birth to a baby girl in a crowded public hospital in the capital. She named her daughter Nora, meaning light, hoping that her child would be a ray of brightness amidst the darkness of her life. Nora was born with brown eyes like her mother's, but they sparkled with a strength Laura believed was inherited from John. In those early days of motherhood, Laura felt both happiness and sorrow. She held Nora in her arms, singing the lullabies her own mother once sang, but tears often rolled down her cheeks as she thought of John. "Do you still remember me, John?" she whispered, her hand touching the necklace. But there was no answer. Life in the capital grew increasingly difficult for Laura. She contracted lupus due to the harsh living conditions, malnutrition, overwork, and lack of medical care. Her skin darkened, her face became gaunt, and her brown eyes sank deep from exhaustion. But Laura never gave up. She took on extra work as a street vendor, braving the scorching sun to sell bread and herbs on the city streets, just to buy milk and diapers for Nora. Every night she held her daughter and cried in their dilapidated room, wondering if John still remembered her. But then she pushed those hopes aside, telling herself, "I have to be strong for Nora. She doesn't need a father. I'll be everything for her." Laura decided not to tell Nora about her father. She didn't want her daughter to grow up with the pain of a father who had disappeared, or to hold on to false hopes about a man she wasn't even sure was still alive. Whenever Nora asked, "Mom, where's my dad?" Laura would give a sad smile and say, "Your dad is in a faraway place, but I love you enough for both of us." She hid the necklace in a small wooden box, as if hiding a part of her past she didn't dare face. Despite illness and poverty, Laura poured all her love into her daughter. She taught Nora to read using old newspapers she collected, sang her the lullabies her mother had sung, and told her stories about the desert, where she had once met John. Laura believed that even if darkness enveloped her own life, Nora would be the light to guide her toward a brighter future. Life in the capital of Saudi Arabia continued to be a series of grueling days, filled with hardship and pain for Laura. After giving birth to Nora, Laura, with her long black hair now faded and her brown eyes sunken from illness, faced challenges more daunting than ever. The lupus she suffered from grew worse, weakening her body day by day. Joint pain, exhaustion, and rashes on her skin made it impossible for her to work long hours as she once did. But Laura refused to give up. She knew that if she stopped, Nora, the only light in her life, would have no future. Every day Laura woke up at 4 a.m., preparing a small batch of bread and herbs to sell on the streets of the capital. She wore a faded blue headscarf to cover her weary face and walked under the city's scorching sun. Her hands trembled as she carried her basket of goods, but she still smiled at customers, trying to earn every penny to buy milk and clothes for Nora. On rainy days, she stood shivering under an awning, clutching her basket, watching people pass by with a heavy heart. "As long as Nora has a better life," she told herself, her voice a soft whisper, like a prayer. The dilapidated room Laura rented in a slum near the Central Market was what she and Nora called home. Its walls were peeling, the roof leaked whenever it rained, and there was no clean water. Laura often had to walk miles to fetch water from a public well, bringing it back in small buckets to cook and bathe Nora. Every night she tucked Nora into the creaky bed, covering her with a thin blanket, then sat beside her, hugging her knees and crying silently. "John, do you still remember me?" she whispered, her hand touching the silver necklace engraved with John and Laura, which she kept hidden in a small wooden box. But there was no answer, only the sound of the wind whistling through the cracks in the walls. Despite illness and poverty, Laura gave all her love to her daughter. She taught Nora to read using old newspapers she scavenged, sang her the lullabies her mother had sung, and told her stories about the desert, where she had once met John. Laura often held Nora close, watching her sleep, and whispered, "You are my light, Nora. No matter how hard life gets, I won't let you suffer." Laura lived with a mix of pain and hope. She didn't dare dream of the day John might return, but she believed Nora would have a brighter future. Every day she fought against illness and poverty, determined to keep her daughter's light from ever fading. In 1992, John Miller returned to Texas after the Gulf War, carrying an unrelenting sense of guilt about Laura. The 29-year-old man with short black hair and deep blue eyes was no longer the optimistic soldier he once was. He was haunted by the image of Laura standing silently in the desert, clutching the necklace he had given her, as he left with a promise to return. But the war had erased all traces of her, and John had no idea how to find her. John decided to start his life anew in America. He enrolled at the University of Texas, majoring in economics, hoping to build a better future, a future he dreamed of sharing with Laura if he ever found her. During his university years, John worked tirelessly, balancing his studies with a part-time job at a gas station to cover his expenses. He graduated with an outstanding degree in 1997 and quickly found a job in the oil industry, a booming sector in Texas. By 2005, John had become a successful entrepreneur, owning a small company that supplied equipment for oil rigs. He bought a large house in the suburbs of Texas, drove a luxury car, and earned the respect of many. But his heart remained empty. Every night, John sat in his study, staring at the only photo he had of Laura, a blurry snapshot taken by a comrade one afternoon in the small village. "Laura, where are you?" he whispered, his voice filled with pain. John never stopped searching for Laura. He reached out to veterans organizations, asking them to look into the village where he had met her. But the war had destroyed everything. The village was no longer on any map, and no one knew where Laura had gone. John also tried searching through humanitarian organizations, but to no avail. He gradually lost hope, but he couldn't forget her. He never married, never opened his heart to anyone else, because in his heart, Laura remained the only one. Despite his success, John always felt his life was missing a piece. He threw himself into work, using his wealth for charity, helping veterans and orphans as a way to atone for his past. But deep down, he knew nothing could make up for the pain of leaving Laura behind. John had no idea that, in a faraway place, Laura was raising their daughter, Nora, alone, pouring all her love and hope into her, while he continued to search tirelessly for a shadow that had long vanished. In 2010, Nora, now 18 years old, stood at the airport in the capital of Saudi Arabia, preparing to board a plane to the U.S. The girl with long, glossy black hair and sparkling brown eyes hugged her mother, Laura, tightly, tears streaming down her face. Nora had just earned a full scholarship to Stanford University in California, a life-changing opportunity that she and her mother had dreamed of for years. Laura, now 36, her face worn from illness, smiled at her daughter, but tears rolled down her cheeks. "Nora, you have to study hard and live well. Do you hear me?" Laura said, her voice trembling. She took a silver necklace engraved with John and Laura from her bag, a keepsake she had held on to for 18 years, and placed it around Nora's neck. "This is a gift I want you to carry with you. It will protect you." Nora touched the necklace, feeling the warmth of her mother's hands, and nodded. "I'll make you proud, Mom." Laura hugged her daughter one last time, watching Nora walk through the security gate, her heart filled with both pride and pain. Nora boarded the plane, carrying her big dreams of a new life in America. She had grown up in poverty, watching her mother work tirelessly to support her, and had always told herself she had to study hard to change their fate. In the capital of Saudi Arabia, Nora had overcome every hardship, studying by the light of an oil lamp, reading books from old newspapers her mother scavenged. The Stanford Scholarship was a reward for her relentless effort, and a beacon of hope for both mother and daughter. When the plane landed in California, Nora stepped out of the airport, her eyes shining with wonder. She gazed at the towering buildings, the wide streets, and felt an entirely new world opening up before her. Nora quickly adapted to life at Stanford. She studied biology, dreaming of becoming a doctor to help the poor, just as her mother had struggled. Despite her busy schedule, Nora called her mother every week, sharing stories of new friends, fascinating lessons, and sending her savings to help her mother with medical expenses. But Nora didn't know that, in America, her father, John Miller, was also living thousands of miles away. She wore the necklace her mother had given her like a protective charm, unaware that it was a keepsake of an unfinished love between her mother and father. Nora also had no idea that fate was about to lead her to a fateful encounter where she would face a devastating truth. With a burning desire to change her life and a pure heart, Nora embarked on a new journey, carrying her big dreams and her mother's love, but also unknowingly drawing closer to a secret that would turn her entire life upside down. In 2012, Nora, now 20 years old, was in her second year at Stanford University in California. The young woman with long, glossy black hair and sparkling brown eyes had become an outstanding student, always standing out in her biology classes. One day, Nora attended an economics seminar at the university where successful entrepreneurs were invited to share their experiences. Among them was John Miller, now 49 years old, a wealthy businessman in the oil industry, with black hair streaked with silver and deep blue eyes that still held the intensity of his younger days. John stepped onto the stage, sharing his journey of overcoming failure to build a successful career. Nora sat in the front row, listening intently. When it came to the Q&A session, she raised her hand, her voice soft but confident. "Sir, how do you overcome major failures in life?" John looked down, and in that moment, he felt a strange familiarity in Nora's brown eyes. He smiled and replied, "Young lady, failure is a lesson. The important thing is that you must believe in yourself and never give up." Nora nodded, her eyes shining with admiration. After the seminar, Nora approached John to thank him. She said, "Thank you, sir. Your words were truly inspiring." John looked at her, the sense of familiarity growing stronger. He asked, "What's your name?" Nora smiled. "I'm Nora, sir." John nodded, but inside a strange feeling stirred. He invited Nora to join him for a private conversation to share more about his experiences. Nora agreed, and from that moment, they began to grow close through their meetings. John became a mentor to Nora. He helped her navigate her career path, shared lessons from his own life, and always encouraged her to pursue her dream of becoming a doctor. Nora admired John's wisdom and warmth, while John was captivated by her intelligence and gentleness. Gradually, their relationship transcended the boundaries of mentor and mentee. John felt his heart, which had been empty for so many years, begin to stir for Nora. He thought to himself, "This girl is truly special, like a light in my life." Nora also felt a deep connection with John. She often told him about her mother, Laura, and the hardships they had faced in the capital of Saudi Arabia. John listened, but it never crossed his mind that Nora's Laura could be the same Laura he had loved 20 years ago. One day, John said to Nora, "You remind me of someone very important in my life." Nora smiled. "Who is that, sir?" John only gave a sad smile, not answering. Their bond grew deeper, and John decided to confess his feelings to Nora. He had no idea that fate was leading them toward an unimaginable tragedy. Nora, with her pure heart, was also unaware that the man she loved was her own father, a truth that would soon come to light, turning her entire life upside down. In December 2012, John Miller and Nora held a small wedding in San Francisco, California. John, now 49, with black hair streaked with silver and deep blue eyes, wore a sleek black tuxedo, standing at the altar with a radiant look of happiness in his eyes. Nora, 20 years old, looked stunning in a pristine white wedding dress, her long black hair flowing naturally as she walked in with a beaming smile. She wore the silver necklace engraved with John and Laura, a keepsake her mother had given her before she left for the U.S. Laura, Nora's mother, flew from the capital of Saudi Arabia to attend her daughter's wedding. The 41-year-old woman, her face worn from illness, wore a simple blue dress and stepped into the church with a heart full of pride. But when Laura saw the groom, John Miller, she froze, nearly fainting. "John, how can you be here?" Laura cried out, her voice trembling, tears streaming down her face. John turned around, saw Laura, and time seemed to stop. He immediately recognized the woman he had loved 20 years ago, the one he had searched for in vain. "Laura, is that you?" John asked, his voice choked with emotion. He stepped forward, seeing the necklace on the floor, and memories flooded back. The days they loved each other in the desert, the promise he had made. But then Laura looked at Nora, then at John, and a horrifying truth dawned on her. She screamed, "John, Nora is your daughter, our daughter." John stood frozen, as if struck by lightning. He looked at Nora, then at Laura, unable to believe his ears. Nora, standing nearby, heard her mother's words and screamed in agony. "What are you saying, Mom?" "That can't be true." She looked at John, her eyes filled with panic, then at her mother, tears pouring down her face. Laura knelt down, embracing Nora, her voice breaking. I'm so sorry, my child. I didn't know. I didn't know he was your father. She recounted everything, the love between her and John during the war, how she became pregnant with Nora after John left, and the years she spent raising her alone. John stood there, his hands trembling, unable to speak. He looked at Nora, the girl he loved, and realized she was his own daughter. Nora pushed her mother away, screaming, "Why didn't you tell me sooner? How could you let this happen?" She ran out of the church, tears streaming endlessly, her pristine white wedding dress now stained with dirt. John fell to his knees, clutching his head, overwhelmed with unbearable pain. Laura embraced him, sobbing, "John, I didn't know. I didn't know she would meet you." The wedding turned into a tragedy. Nora fled, carrying a pain she couldn't endure. John and Laura held each other, crying, realizing that fate had played a cruel trick on them, turning their love into a horrifying truth that could never be undone. After the devastating shock on the wedding day, John Miller decided to make amends with Laura and Nora. He flew to the capital of Saudi Arabia, searching for the dilapidated room where Laura was living. The woman, her face worn from lupus, was stunned to see John standing at her door. "Laura, I'm so sorry," John said, his voice choked with emotion. He knelt down, embracing her, tears rolling down his face. Laura cried too, but she didn't blame him. "You didn't know, John. Neither did I," she whispered. John convinced Laura and Nora to return to Texas with him. He took Laura to the best hospital to treat her lupus, covering all medical expenses and caring for her like a lifelong friend. For Nora, John supported her to continue her studies at Stanford University, even though she initially refused to see him. Nora, with her long black hair and brown eyes filled with hurt, couldn't accept the fact that the man she loved was her own father. But over time, she began to open up. One day she came to see John, looking at him with eyes full of both pain and tenderness, and said, "Dad." It was the first time she called him that, and they both embraced, crying in each other's arms. John, Laura, and Nora gradually healed their wounds. Together, they established a charity foundation called Nora's Light of Hope, aimed at helping orphans and families affected by war. John used his wealth to build support centers, providing education and healthcare opportunities for hundreds of children. Laura, with her health slowly improving, became the foundation's manager, finding new meaning in life through helping others. Nora, though still carrying her pain, resolved to pursue her dream of becoming a doctor, hoping to save the poor and struggling, just as her mother had once endured. Through the foundation, their family found peace. John and Laura couldn't return to what they once were, but they became companions, working together to make up for what Nora had lost. Nora, though she had lost her love, found family. She often sat beside her mother, wearing the necklace engraved with John and Laura, and smiled, "Mom, I don't hate anymore. I have Dad and you. That's enough." The story ends with a humane message. Love and kindness can heal any wound, even if it comes late. John, Laura, and Nora, from an unimaginable tragedy, found light in the darkness. They not only healed themselves, but also brought hope to others. Despite a past filled with pain, they chose forgiveness, love, and together built a brighter future. Their story is proof that, no matter how cruel fate may be, the human heart can still find redemption through love and compassion.